everyone. Welcome to the special keynote address of the Summer Workshop in Public Finance and Economic Policy. My name is Pavlina Cherneva, and I direct the Economic Democracy Initiative, your host for this workshop. We are gathered here today at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park. 50 students from 5 continents, 22 different countries, 20 scholars and academics from around the world. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing to you our special guest, friend and colleague, Dr. James Galbraith, the Lloyd and Bentsen Junior Chair in Government and Business at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Galbraith is a world-renowned expert and sought-after policy advisor whose list of pioneering research, seminal books and papers, and consequential policy work is long. I would like to single out one episode in his illustrious career. In the late 1970s, Professor Galbraith was an economist for the House Banking Committee of the U.S. Congress and later became the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee. As part of that work, Jamie drafted the monetary sections of one of the most important laws in U.S. history, the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1978, or as it is formally known, the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. Now, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, has had for a very long time a dual mandate, full employment and price stability. But inflation fighting had always eclipsed the full employment objective, and without much accountability. Today, the Fed provides regular testimony before Congress on how well it is achieving its dual mandate. Now, Jamie wrote that section into law, among others, that requires the Fed to report to Congress on its work. As he had once told me, the law intentionally kept the scope of Fed policy wide. The purpose was not to impose some kind of economic theory on policy making, but really to foster an open dialogue of what monetary policy is and what it is supposed to do. And yet today, the legacy of monetarism continues to commandeer monetary policy, the belief that there is some trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Even as the Fed acknowledges today that labor markets are not the source of inflation, economists continue to insist that unemployment and labor market slack are the only way to fight inflation. Well, there are other ways, better ways, more enlightened and effective ways. Jamie is also son of towering figure and public intellectual, the late economist John Kenneth Galbraith. Galbraith, the father, worked for the Franklin Delano Roosevelt presidency as the head of the price section of the U.S. government's Office of Price Administration during World War II, the very agency that prevented runaway inflation during the war and price gouging by wartime contractors, or as FDR called them, merchants of death. Price controls are once again being hotly debated, so how shall the Fed move forward? This is the topic of the day. Please join me in welcoming Professor Galbraith.
Thanks very much indeed. And, introduction and reminder of some events quite a long time ago. And it might have occurred to you that since I was actually capable of making the transition from my chair to this podium, that in the late 1970s I could not have been very old. And the truth was that when I was first assigned to work on monetary policy and the problem of Federal Reserve accountability to the Congress, I had just arrived after 1 year in graduate school, and I was at the ripe age of 23. And This is how governments actually function under some conditions. The question is, why did I get this responsibility? And the answer is obviously, the only possible answer is nobody else thought it was worth taking an interest in. And so it was left, as some things are, to the most junior person on the staff. I look out at this audience and I say, this may well happen to some of you at some point. Just keep your eyes open. Don't let the opportunity go by, because 50 years later, somebody might come along and remember what happened. Anyway, we're here at this, it's essentially a shrine to the theme of this symposium, which is economic democracy. And Pavlina encouraged me to talk a little bit about a problem which most people do not associate with the Roosevelt administration. Most people, when they think about the Roosevelt administration, they think about, first of all, the Great Depression and the New Deal, and secondly, about the mobilization to win the war. They don't think about inflation. And they don't think about inflation because inflation was a problem that was handled, and it also was a problem. The way in which it was handled is something which our profession, the economics profession, has put an enormous effort over the subsequent 70 years into forgetting. And what I want to do today is to walk you through a little bit of that experience and then talk about its application to our present situation. But to do that, I think we first of all need to take a moment and ask ourselves, what actually is inflation? What are we talking about when we mention this word? Because I imagine that most of you who have encountered it, at least in the classroom in a textbook, have a particular theoretical notion of what inflation is. And I want to suggest that, first of all, it is something more than the very prosaic idea of a change, of the rate of change of prices over time, which is the definition given to it very recently by a couple of the senior advisors in the Biden White House, Janet Bernstein being one of them. So we need to have something that gives us a greater conception of what we're dealing with. Also say that inflation is not like unemployment. Often paired with unemployment as a concept, but it's very different. Unemployment is something you experience as a person. It is something you can count. It is a concept that was invented for statistical and administrative purposes, actually in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the 1860s, 1870s, to deal with an emergent phenomenon of the industrial age. Inflation is an event that happens to the society as a whole. It can happen, presumably, anywhere, and it is measured in a particular way, a technical way, by constructing a price index and looking at the change of that index over time. So it's not a counting phenomenon in the same sense as unemployment is. We have a tendency, then, to abstract our notion of inflation, to conceptualize it in terms that I would call pure inflation. It's a textbook concept, in which we think about, if you like, the devaluation of the monetary union with respect to newly produced goods and services. In other words, a general increase in the price of everything that is newly produced. This is a very convenient definition from the standpoint of economic ideology. Milton Friedman was adverting to it when he said that inflation was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And I want to suggest that in the real world, this is something which is rarely or perhaps never experienced. 16th century Europe, okay, sufficiently remote, and I wasn't around. The influx of American silver mainly, and also gold from the Spanish conquest is associated with a general decline in the monetary unit. But the modern world, I think we do not see significant examples of this phenomenon, certainly not in countries which have relatively stable monetary systems. So I want to focus our attention on the kind of inflation, which I'll call everyday inflation, that we have experienced in our lifetimes, that we've experienced in the last few years, and that the Roosevelt administration confronted at the outset of the Second World War. Typically, the propagation of some event, a shock to prices, often, not always, energy prices, that then moves through the structure of prices and wages. Typically, war is a major source of this kind of disruption because it upends the normal course of civilian economic life. Left unchecked or undealt with, everyday inflation of this kind, unlike the pure inflation of the textbook, always has an effect on distribution. There are always winners and always losers. And this is what makes it particularly important as a political tool. Everyday inflation may be something that goes away after a period of time, but it can also be sustained by mechanisms inside the structure of the economy. In the 1970s, when I was first working on this, those structures were embedded in a sequence of major trade union contracts, automobiles, steel, rubber, the so-called Treaty of Detroit, which, because they were staggered, if one union got a good settlement, then the next one insisted on the same settlement, and the process repeated over time. That's not the situation that we see now. But you can see a certain persistence, and that persistence of that period has stuck in the minds of the economists of my generation, a point that I'll come back to. Does it matter whether we take one view or another of the inflation process? Well, I think it obviously matters a great deal, and I think it matters an enormous amount that we, you, and I, and everybody else has been induced and guided toward the theoretical vision of a pure inflation as a monetary phenomenon over time. What are the consequences of that? The consequences are that we are induced then to accept the handing over of responsibility for inflation to a monetary authority, specifically to the central bank. On the other hand, if you take the alternative view that the problem that we are encountering, and nobody is saying that it's not a problem, but that the problem we are encountering is one which is associated with practical questions of war, resource availability, the supply chains we've experienced recently, then you may be led to ask, how can we deal with those problems? What's the nature of those problems, and what should we do to handle them? Well, then you have to ask, how would we judge whether such a policy had been successful? And the answer surely cannot be simply that after a certain period of time, the rate of change in the price index slows down and stops. You have to ask, at what cost? With what consequences? With what effect on the coherence, viability, even the survival of the society and the government? And specifically, and this is the question on which we were focused in the late 1970s in trying to draft essentially an amendment to the Employment Act of 1945, a new version of it that brought full employment into the statutory framework explicitly. The answer has to be one, how can you do this without inflicting undue hardship on the most vulnerable people, without impoverishing people, without mass unemployment? In wartime, of course, the problem becomes escalated. It's even a question of national survival of life and death to do this effectively. A country which breaks down in wartime situation under hyperinflation is unlikely to be able to sustain the military effort that's required to prevail in the conflict. Has such a success ever been achieved? The answer to that, and this is the great forgotten point, is yes. It was achieved between 1941 and 1946 under the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, during which unemployment was held at 0. A war was fought that required that the total economic output of the country be doubled over 4 years, and yet inflation remained under very strict control. That policy was implemented by an agency, the Office of Price Administration, of which a 33-year-old man by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith, my father, was placed in charge of prices in 1940. The key implementation of that program was in 2 phases. One began in May of 1942, the General Maximum Price Regulation, which required essentially that if you wished to raise any price anywhere in the country, you had to get the permission of my father or one of the 17,000 people who worked for him. I asked him how he found 17,000 people in a few months to staff the Office of Price Administration. And he said, land-grant colleges, I hired all of the economics professors. So those of you who are heading into that, any of that, he also hired all kinds of interesting people who went on to, I could go on at length to the history of that, never mind. In May of 1943, conflict over particular implementation of policy, my father was dismissed because they thought they needed a businessman to deal with these issues. They brought in an advertising executive named Chester Bowles, who proved to be even harder line than my father was. And there was basically the whole line order, which froze all prices for the duration of the war. And this is important for this seminar, because this was, in fact, the greatest exercise in economic democracy in the history of the United States. Because how was that enforced? It was enforced by setting up civilian boards in every community in the country, like the draft board. And you had to go through your local price board if you wanted to raise any price, and they were always going to say no. So this was enforced by bringing the entire consumer population of the country into the economic governance and democratizing what had been the preserve of private business. You know, we often think, and I'm sure many of you have experienced at least a little bit of contact with the work of John Maynard Keynes, and think of him surely in terms of government deficits and fiscal and monetary policy. But the work of the Office of Price Administration was very micro-oriented. And one day, Keynes came to the OPA with a paper that he wanted to share with my father. It was about the problem of the price control of what he called maize and pigs, corn and hogs. Keynes was raising pigs on his farm in England, so he was interested in this problem. You can see, there he is, John Maynard Keynes. There's my father, John Kenneth Galbraith. They're, according to the New Yorker cartoonist Edward Sorel, they are examining the photograph of a pig. Well, that is a bit of a stretch of imagination, but everything else, the typewriter, the hat, the telephone, is period from 1942. And this meeting did happen. My father said it was like St. Peter dropping in on the parish priest. How did price controls work? I think we can answer that at the micro level and at the macro level. At the micro level, they worked very simply by preventing the abuse of monopoly market power, by preventing price gouging. And when you did not have the option of raising your price, what could you do if you wanted to make money? You had to improve your productivity and increase your volume. Those are the options. And that was why the United States was able to double its total output, to hold its civilian output constant and increase its non-civilian output to 100% of its civilian output. Tanks, planes, the atomic bomb, aircraft carriers, everything So that's number one. It created an environment for economic expansion and full employment. And number two, at a more macro level, the fact that there was no inflation meant that if you were holding a financial asset, United States government bonds, Series E bonds, you were happy to hold them at 2% and hold them into the 50s, into 1960s, because you thought they were going to maintain their purchasing power. And that was what price controls have achieved. And that meant that the excess saving, which was again 100% of the civilian purchasing power, did not come back and was not used to, did not come back to drive up the price of commodities and cause hoarding and other disruptions and disruptions. Well, this was not popular with everybody. It was in fact broadly popular with the population. There were riots in 1946 when price controls were released, were removed. But fair to say, a fair fraction of the business community did not like being under price controls. I'm not saying everybody, but they do infringe on the natural right of the business person to charge whatever the market will be. They also empower both government officials and ordinary civilians to take a role in decisions that businesses characteristically believe to be their own. And the professional economists, who are always in a majority of their number in line with the ideology of the business community, hate price controls because they run counter to the standard theory of the economics profession, which is that price adjustment is how markets work to achieve efficient resource allocation. No, it's not how markets work to achieve. That's just how textbooks tell you that they work. But in fact, markets don't work that way at all. But in any event, over the course of the subsequent decades, the idea that price adjustment in markets was the key to allocation of efficiency became the core. And I bet for those of you, I'm sure everybody here has taken a basic economics course, this is probably the first idea that comes up in that textbook. And that's simply not the way the world has worked or works now. It sets up an ideal world in which there is no market power, in which there is no stability of cost and relation of cost to prices. A world which does not exist, and I think it's fair to say has actually never existed. But there was also a body of macro thinking, if you like, that's associated with this. This really emerged in the 50s and 60s of the last century in a way that reinforced the policies of microeconomics. The conjecture of a Phillips curve, a stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment, advanced by Santos and Solo in 1960, lasted for about a decade before it began to fall apart, giving you an idea that perhaps it was not the universal truth that it was suggested that it was. Phelps and Friedman, Ned Phelps and Milton Friedman in 67 and 68, basically shoved the old Phillips curve aside and replaced it with the notion of a very steep or essentially vertical relationship, the so-called long-run Phillips curve, associated with a so-called natural rate of unemployment or non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, the NIRU, that has been a plague on the thinking of the macro section of the textbooks for the last 50 years. These ideas have not been always unchallenged. I'll give you a couple of articles that appeared in exactly the same journal. One of them by a notoriously bad-tempered dissident who published in 1997 under the title "Time to Ditch the Nehru," and the other one by a much nicer person, a leading mainstream economist, former chief economist of the IMF and chairman of the department at MIT, who came along it was in 2018 with an article in the same journal with the question mark, very polite, should we reject the natural rate hypothesis? Well, you can see it took me 21 years to raise 2 daughters to voting age, and I was not able to persuade the mainstream of the economics profession to move except a tiny little bit off of a settled position and to have this which I can't succeed at everything in life. But this reasoning here underlying this hypothesis continues to be a part of our dialogue. Here's Jason Furman, Harvard University, arguing in 2022, labor markets remain extremely tight, therefore essentially inflation is high and possibly rising, and therefore we must tolerate several years of very high unemployment in order to get down to that target of 2%, an average unemployment rate of 6.5% in 2023 and 2024. And I make a note that Professor Furman did not himself volunteer to join the unemployed in this public spirited crusade. A second kind of argument, which I don't want to spend too much time on it, is the idea that the economy naturally fluctuates around a total output equilibrium. It's a rising trend. And we can see that reasoning underpinning, for example, Lawrence Summers in May of 2021, talking about how inflationary pressures are mounting from boosts in demand given by the pandemic, given by the Federal Reserve's policy, given by forecasts. I don't know how forecasts affect inflation, never mind. So the syntax here is perhaps a little overheated, but you will notice that these are all macro factors. There's no mention here of oil, no mention of semiconductors, no mention of anything else that's specifically driving up, might be specifically driving up prices. Since I'm speaking more slowly than I thought, I will leave that one off and just move to the question of where this leaves us in terms of a policy focus. The mainstream has settled on the notion that the central bank has responsibility, that this is supported by the administration, including the Biden administration, which is happy to have another agency, preferably one insulated from the electorate, take responsibility for inflicting pain. So politically it's very convenient. There's a target instead of 2%. Sometime 20 or 30 years ago, some economists said that's what we want. There's no basis in law. It's not in the Humphrey-Hawkins Act for 2%. It's never been codified by Congress. And there's no specific way this is supposed to be achieved. Milton Friedman had the idea that it should be done by controlling the money supply. They allegedly attempted that for a few years in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and abandoned it. And since then, we have some kind of mystical relationship. Control of interest rates subject to the Federal Reserve basically declaring what its inflation target is. I have to take personal responsibility because all of this emerges from precisely the congressional hearings for which I was responsible for almost a decade in the 1970s. This is Chairman Paul Volcker appearing before the House Banking Committee with the ghost of Wright Patman staring over his shoulder in vast disapproval. I am undoubtedly sitting on the other side of that camera in the back of the members of Congress. And this is a process which has become extremely familiar, embedded institutionally, to the point where it has become almost a cult in the economics profession to believe that the Fed can tell the world what it's going to do and the world will cooperate with it. So we have again Ken Rogoff of Harvard talking about the relationship between inflation and Federal Reserve policy. Jason Furman, all these people are Harvard people. I wonder when that's the case. And again, talking about the need for the Federal Reserve to ratchet up its policies. Those of you who are Roosevelt fans may have encountered his great Madison Square Garden speech in the campaign of 1940, when he named the three bête noire, the three forces of darkness in American politics, members of Congress, I believe all three of them. They said it's Martin, Barton, and Fish. Hamilton Fish was the congressman from here, by the way. Well, now, in my view, it's Jason, Larry, and Ken. So that Rooseveltian note on. Jason's timing was exquisite. This is not very readable, but in fact, almost as soon as he had published the need for the Federal Reserve to continue raising rates for inflation to fall, inflation started falling. In fact, it had already peaked in June of 2022, which tells you just how good the guidance that mainstream economics, macroeconomics gives to the practitioners of this particular approach. And it has, of course, been falling ever since. There are reasons why we are led to believe that inflation is more persistent than it is. One of them is that the numbers are published, and the headline always refers to a 12-month phenomenon in the last 12 months, which means that there's a reason for this, that the monthly number is very volatile. A 12-month number is much more stable. But it also means that if there is a single shock, it continues in the numbers for 11 more months, even though there's no new news. And this has a terrible consequence, which it gives Jason, Larry, and Ken each 11 additional opportunities to write op-ed pieces on why the Federal Reserve should continue to raise interest rates. So you have to recognize there's an interplay between media practice and economic policy in this work here. All right, come back to the real world. What were the actual sources of the increase in prices that we experienced in 2021, 2022, and that have since tapered off, although I will be the first to say that we may not be at the end of the experience of seeing this kind of problem. The first one clearly was oil. Oil prices collapsed at the start of the pandemic to the point that the forward price of a barrel of oil fell below zero briefly, and that creates a steep gradient even when oil price simply recovered to the levels that it had held a year or two previously. But there was an additional factor, which is that when the price collapsed, the properties became cheap and speculative interest moved into the oil patch. And when the demand recovered, they didn't raise supply to meet the demand. They raised it at a slower rate and enjoyed a vast windfall on all the barrels that they did produce. Good profit maximizing behavior if you happen to be a private equity investor in this particular asset. So that's one problem that was dealt with actually by the administration through the sale of oil from this particular reserve. A second phenomenon was in the automobile sector. There was a shortage of new cars because there was a shortage of semiconductors. New car prices didn't rise all that much, which old used car prices went up by 50%. Because that's a market, an asset market, which the dealer will sell it to you for whatever they can get. That's much more volatile. It's also not a newly produced good. It shouldn't be in a measure of pure inflation, but it is in the statistically called the consumer price index. And then there's a third issue, which has to do with the way rents are translated into the housing component, which is 40% of the index. And I won't take time to deal with that specifically, but that's a very major distortion in the way in which we measure this. Okay. Are there issues that need to be dealt with going forward? The answer to that is yes, just as they were in the 1940s, just as they were in the 1970s, just as they were in 2021 and 2022. But these are issues that arise, if you like, on the, I don't like the supply and demand, but they arise within the structure of the economy and its provision of particular goods and services. One of them is the tendency of businesses to leapfrog each other, raising margins in order to hedge against the risk that their costs may go up in the period ahead. And so you get what is in fact a kind of profit spiral, a major component of increasing prices, both here and in Europe, by the way, has been an increase in business margins. The appropriate policy response to that, as it was under the Office of Price Administration, is selective and strategic controls, or maybe comprehensive controls with selective exceptions, which is the 1942 version. And yet that agenda remains strongly off, that idea remains strongly off the mainstream. Second possibility here, second risk, is that the energy sector is not stable, and we do not know. There are uncertainties of geology and uncertainties of geopolitics. But we need a policy that is focused on that sector in a coherent way, taking account, of course, of the environmental challenges that we face. A third is what is called a iatrogenic disease, namely that ailments caused by the doctor. That is the application of the high interest rate policy to the cost structure of businesses. Interest is a cost. If a business is affected by a higher interest rate, it will try to pass that along to its customers. In that respect, until the interest rate policies actually crack the economy and produce mass unemployment, they are not, generally speaking, anti-inflation. They're adding fuel to the fire. And finally, the fourth thing is, I think we're all basically familiar with the fact that we are moving slowly perhaps, but I think inexorably, to what can be described as a multipolar world in which the dollar's purchasing power over the world's supply of commodities is going to erode over time. I'm not sure that there is any sensible or effective solution to that problem. It may be something with which we will simply, as Americans, have to live. We could perhaps have avoided it had we conducted a more coherent and, let's say, worldly global policy over the last 25 years, but we didn't, and we will pay the price for not doing so. All right, our last point, and that is, if you are inclined to take the words I'm offering you seriously, you need to be aware that you will be running a very significant professional risk. There's an example here of a young scholar whose work I think is among the best available in the next generation. This is Isabella Weber, the University of Massachusetts, who had the temerity in December of 2022 to suggest that perhaps the history of price control in the United States in the 1940s in the Roosevelt administration had relevance before the problems. The reaction was beyond vicious. Mentioned Paul Krugman, who is, holds down the position of the avatar of the moderate left in the New York Times, tweeted that he was extremely stupid, a remark that he did retract, but nevertheless he made it to a vast audience. And in the current issue of the New Yorker, Zachary Carter tells about the wave of hostile reaction in the social media space and the professional economic space that Isabella Weber, who was 33 at the time, had to endure. It is fair to say, and I'm happy to say, that she has been vindicated. This is the heading in the current issue of the New Yorker. And as of, I think, 2 days ago, Isabella Weber was granted tenure at the University of Massachusetts. So it is possible to triumph over this form of adversity, but it takes a certain amount of determination and moral courage. So with that, I'm just saying thank you.
Okay, questions?
Thank you so much. It was a very interesting lecture. My question is, because you mentioned a lot about the FDR government and their success against in inflation fighting, at the same time maintaining full employment or whilst they were fighting a war. But to what extent do you think the war variable needs to be understood there? Because there was, of course, a need for American products around the world.
Pablita, perhaps you can, my ability to decipher through the electronic means is somewhat limited.
Yeah, I was just asking you, to what extent do you think the war itself was responsible for the surge in the American economy at that time? And do you think without the war happening, where American economy is basically, where American products are very much in demand, do you think that could be replicated today?
The war created great demand for American product. I think probably in the military.
You mean the Second World War?
The Second World War. Could that be replicated today in the sense that the economy grew at such an extraordinary way because of the war? Can that be replicated today?
Oh, no, I don't think you could replicate the material conditions of the Second World War. Because the New Deal had laid the foundation for a vast increase in industrial output. It had electrified the Tennessee Valley, for example, the Columbia River. It had built an enormous amount of underlying infrastructure. It had trained a mechanically competent population. So all of these pieces were in place in 1940, and at that point, they knew that a war was coming, and they knew that its outcome would rest very heavily on American production, and they were prepared. I'll tell you something else that my father did, actually, which I discovered on writing an undergraduate thesis at Harvard in 1974. His first job in Washington was an advisor to the National Defense Advisory Commission, and was charged with locating ammunition factories throughout the country. So picking out the locations for government-owned contractor-operated plants to produce shells and bombs. This was something which required a certain background in agriculture, because the chemistry is the same as fertilizer. And so it was done with that in mind. But all of this was knowing that sooner or later the U.S. would be involved in the European war. Do we have the capacity to plan out and execute? Do we have the resources to do it? And from our present starting point, I think the answer to that is probably not, because we have in fact wasted a great deal of capability over the last 4 years. That's the tragedy of the situation. The capacity to do these things is now, if we were in China, it would be a different story. That's where you can see this kind of processing and the capability is these days. Not here.
Hi. You mentioned local price control boards being effective. Yeah. So you mentioned that local price control boards were an effective measure to curb inflation. Is it possible for local governments or state governments to just implement these boards themselves today?
So, I think my answer to that is no, that a policy to be effective really has to be carried out at the national scale. State and local governments can have some influence and have had on their wage rates, but even that would be much better if it were uniform and national, because you then reduce the incentive for businesses to relocate their activities and redirect their product flow, which they would do very quickly. There's no barrier to interstate commerce. If your price was controlled in Boston and not controlled in New York City, the trucks would go to New York and not to Boston. So that's a reason why you have to have Policy basically on important matters, generally speaking, needs to be set at the center.
Hi, thank you very much. I love the whole thing. So with a lot of like the mergers and greater monopolies and a lot of like antitrust kind of conversations, do you think where we are now, if a similar kind of price control mechanism would be more difficult because of the increased mergers and monopolies, and how so? Do you think we should be paired like with more like antitrust like efforts?
Well, nobody says these things would be easy. And they weren't easy in the early 1940s either. Well, some things were easier than others. Give you two examples. On the Sunday after Pearl Harbor, there was a meeting of the National Defense Advisory Commission, I believe it was, going over raw materials. Well, according to the story I heard, they went through alphabetical order, so it was a tedious meeting until they got to R and the word rubber came up. And two people left the meeting. One of them was my father. The other was a lawyer named David Ginsburg. They went back to their office and they drafted an order banning the sale of rubber tires in the United States. They had no authority. They went around to the War Production Board and to the commissioners at home and said, here's the order, sign it. These guys didn't know who they were talking to, didn't care that they weren't working, these people were not working for the War Production Board. They signed the order, and so Dad and David Ginsburg went back to their office, called the networks, and the next morning, rubber tires were not on sale in the United States. According to my mother, that day she said, I'm going out to buy galoshes for the children. My father said, no, under no circumstances will you do any such thing, and I'm not telling you why. Getting the automobile companies to stop producing cars for the very lucrative consumer market was harder. And Ford and GM didn't stop. They continued to produce. They produced about 250,000 vehicles using steel and aluminum and other and rubber as well, important strategic materials. And the government then issued a stop work order and confiscated the 250,000 cars. That became the federal government fleet for the rest of the war. So yes, the use of power here is something that has to be contemplated, and you have to be willing to do it. After a certain amount of time, people become more cooperative. If they think they can break the rules and get away with it, then you're going to be in trouble. Sorry.
Well, let's go up. It's easier for you, right?
I appreciate you coming up.
Well, it seems like it's easier than.
Yeah.
So that was a kind of, those were larger corporate. To what extent, to your knowledge, I don't know the answer, was there kind of cooperative and effective sort of black market or sort of invention on the part of market forces?
During the Second War, the black market was very minor. And the reason for that was that there was a general availability of crucial supplies. So there was rationing, but the rationing did not, it led to what the rationing did was to impede hoarding and speculative use of things like butter and sugar and other daily commodities that would then have generated a black market. So my understanding of that experience is that, well, they can't say there was none. The black market remained a very small piece of the picture, and by and large, the system worked.
Thank you so much for the lecture. As you mentioned during your lecture, with the dollar losing its hegemonic position on the international market, taking into consideration the latest news with BRICS and trying to create a reserve currency backed by a handful of their currencies, where do you think this puts U.S. in the long run and the rest of the world as well?
Yeah, I would distinguish between two distinct phenomena here. One of them is the use of the currency in settlement of trade. And we are seeing a lot of determination now to settle bilateral balances between China and India, within the African countries, and in the BRICS framework, in the national currencies. So long as the trade is reasonably balanced, that's almost a momentary transaction. Right? You acquire RMB or rupees or rubles, and then you use them, and you end up where you were before. So I don't think of that as having intrinsically an effect on the role of the dollar. The bigger problem here is the use of when there's a substantial imbalance, are the people who are in a surplus position, what do they hold as a reserve? Because that's what affects the asset price. And my view is that as much as countries would like and will reduce their use of dollars as reserves, they will be reluctant to move to a completely fragmented system because it's more unstable. And the US government bond market is very vast, it's very liquid, and so long as everybody else is using it, it's stable. What's the threat? The threat is the effect of the sanctions. Because we have said first to the Afghans and to the Iranians and now to the Russians that your dollar assets reserves are not safe. We can confiscate them and freeze them. Maybe we'll even confiscate them. Well, if you're not worried about crossing the United States on some major foreign policy question, maybe you don't take that all that seriously. If you are worried about it, and a big country that is worried about it is obviously China, you're going to reduce your exposure. It's a sensible, rational thing to do. So from that point of view, see gun, see shoot, see foot, shoot. I mean, we have really done, in the interest of pursuing a foreign policy or a series of foreign policy objectives, we have, I think, taken measures that will erode something we were getting largely from the world community for free, the Americans were, which was a huge amount of purchasing power over their goods. They gave them an asset they were willing to hold because it was more stable than the alternatives. Now they will improvise, in many cases, to find something that's almost as good. And we'll see how it plays.
Well, yeah, I suppose it's a direct follow-up. It's a direct follow-up. So if you were able to set U.S. foreign policy to rectify that self-inflicted wound by the United States, how would you set about doing it?
I would have started about 25 years ago, and I would not have. I would have. Gore v. Bush would have. Bush v. Gore would have come out a different way, because I think once you move yourself in the world to the illusion that you're able to control it, you're on a slippery slope. And we have been on that slope for a long time. And I think those who are going to have responsibility in the future for U.S. foreign policy are going to have to deal with many, many years of erosion of the world's willingness to let the United States play the role that we aspired to play in the aftermath of the decline of the fall of the Soviet Union. I don't think there's any way around that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to come up a little bit. So maybe another kind of future-oriented question, a little bit picking up on this, but on a different topic, which is, I'm curious what you see moving forward as the main sources of inflation, whether transitory or longer, more just like what the causes will be. Do you think that the sort of energy, commodity shocks, or supply chain, semiconductor, geopolitical, and kind of housing market, those were the four that I saw you identify as sort of supply side or supply chain related shocks that we've seen a lot of. And it seems from what I work on that most of those will continue, but I'm wondering if you agree or if you think there are other sources of inflation on the horizon that most people aren't talking about yet. I guess I'm asking you to span forward a few years and what do things look like?
You're asking me to play a role that I avoid conscientiously, which is forecasting. I'll tell another story. The answer is, I put up those four because I could say something about them because we've seen them. What will happen in the future, we will discover in the future. It is not true, by the way, as the internet will misinform you, that my father coined the remark that a function of astrology was to make economic forecasting. The function of economic forecasting was to make astrology look respectable. He didn't. It wasn't him. It is in the nature of the internet that if there's one clever person, then every clever remark gets attributed to that person. But I have been waging a decades-long battle on behalf of an obscure Stanford professor and member of the Council of Economic Advisors under Richard Nixon, a guy by the name of Ezra Solomon, who was actually responsible for making that immortal remark.
Thank you for the informative and interesting lecture. So nowadays, due to the globalization and the free trade, in most of the developing countries there is a trend of dollarization. Most of the transactions are made in dollar currency, but according to the modern money theory, the countries are suggested to strengthen their own currency and make transactions in the own currency. So what do you think about this dollarization and strengthening the own currency?
The creation of regional currency blocks is
yes.
Well, we will see. A number of efforts were made at various times. There have been regional currency blocks in East Africa and Central America. And I think there may have been an effort to make one in the Southern Cone. I've always thought that this is a language joke, we may not all get it, but I thought if there was a North American regional currency, then in honor of our neighbors in Quebec, it should be called the Amer. It's French for bitter. And if there was a South American one, it should be called in honor of the two languages, Spanish and Portuguese. It should obviously be called the Sur Real. Okay, so sorry about that. Will they succeed? I don't have an enormous amount of confidence to take your question seriously of that one can easily move to a currency block and make it work for all the participants. The great example of failure to do that right now is the euro, which is a regional currency block, been in existence since 1999, and it has produced an increasing divergence between North Europe, Germany in particular, and the Mediterranean, the so-called periphery. They're actually the center of Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and also Ireland, notably. This is a difficulty of managing a multi-currency zone when you have an imbalance, when some of the countries are historically quite strong and others on surpluses and the others are quite weak. And then you have a central bank which implements the policy of the strong currency against and the weak ones become increasingly impoverished and effectively colonized. So this is a danger. Now, if you did this in a continental setting, let's just say South America, or in parts of Asia, perhaps, could you, or let's say, again, there's a proposal in Africa, could you do this in a way which was better managed than the euro? The answer is you could hardly do it in a way which was worse managed than the euro. So one has little hope on that ground. But on the other hand, you could emulate the euro and effectively get a neoliberal system imposed through a central bank. So it has to be very, very careful. I would generally think that countries are better off maintaining their own currencies, running their own central banks, and then negotiating on a nation-to-nation basis. And that the important thing is for different nations, large and small, to enter these arrangements in an atmosphere of real respect for each other's priorities and for each other's welfare. This is what Keynes tried to do in the aftermath of the war, but instead we got the America-centered system, particularly, especially so after 1980. That's where the danger comes. One should not replace the predatory dollar-based system with predatory systems that are based in some other big countries' currencies. Well, thank you for the question.
Last question.
Hi. Thank you very much for the lecture. I just wanted two quick questions. I just want to know, for example, which would be the best position of the interest rates in the U.S. considering what we have seen about unemployment and inflation and these conventional ideas. And also, second question, I would like to know what would you recommend to this new generation economists in the future to combat this conventional view of economics?
Okay, second part of the questions that one I'll address first, which is you will learn a great deal more from the study of economic history and from the study of the history of economic thought. So in general, you should focus on all of those subjects that nobody wants to teach. That's where the useful knowledge lies hidden. The other two areas I would mention I think that are extremely valuable: statistics and, just generally speaking, economic policy. Right? This will get you no respect or prestige in academic economics, but you will perhaps understand something about the world which you can use to build a new foundation for a useful economics going forward. So that's the first thing. As far as interest rates are concerned, well, I'll tell you another story. Another story that goes back to the 1970s, when I was just, a young staffer sitting at my desk in the office of a very wonderful and distinguished member of Congress. Now, those are not words that are normally strung together. Distinguished member of Congress, but nevertheless, they did exist. And the one I was working for was Henry Royce of Wisconsin. Actually, someone who had worked with my father on the Office of Price Administration during the war. And we would get letters. He would get letters. Hand-typed, thin paper from a guy named Herbert Babb. Babb was an independent consultant in Santa Barbara, California. And the letters were always the same. They said, if John Maynard Keynes was still alive, he would favor a low rate of interest. I always wrote him back. And this is my lesson to all of you. Answer your correspondence. I always wrote him back. My response was always the same, thanking him for his advice, and that Congressman Royce and I shared his sentiment and that of John Maynard Keynes, and were doing what we could do to help bring down the rate of interest. And I don't know, probably 10 or 20 of these letters over the years. I was later at a dinner in Massachusetts and Cambridge with a number of senior economists, and I asked them if they had received such letters. Every single one of them had, from Herbert Babb. I said, did you ever reply? No, these hotshots were too busy to reply. But in 1982, roughly, I received, the last letter I received from Mr. Babb came in a thick manila envelope. The letter said, it was to me, he said, I think you are the best person to have these. And it contained about 7 or 8 lengthy letters on all of the stationery, King's College, Tilton, Bloomsbury, from 1937 to 1944 to Herbert Babb, from John Maynard Keynes. So, as I said, that's my final piece of advice. Answer your emails, you just never know who they're coming from.
Thank you. Now we have a treat for you. It's a tour of the library. And so Tess and right, you will lead the group and I'll show you where to go. Enjoy your